Alright, gang, we'll see you. Anyway, wait a second. Alright, so I'm back and I was gonna watch this lecture, but before we do that, I'm gonna show you this, which is incredible to say the least. It's a special wrestling technique. That was incredible. Imagine that guy worked gluten. He's definitely not gluten, but that he W for everybody involved, the crowd, them, the guy who invented the special move. All right, so let's watch this. Let's try to learn
see some of that
something
here. And so that
Tools
means she
for
studied
making
things
the
like
invisible
artistic
visible.
expression or creative
Now,
expression in
cognitive
visual and other
tools.
media. She's very interested in narrative expression. She's really interested in education, learning, and teaching, and how we make sense of the world symbolically and through data and explanation. And she's really moved towards these much more complex cognitive processes that are really distinctively human, both biologically and culturally, and increasingly really of great import in our current era. But she hasn't given up any of the rigor, or I would say her taste for rigor. And I know from a lot of interactions with Judy that what keeps her up at night is the struggle and the challenge of how do you get at these really important, hard things with the kind of rigor and precision that many of us grew up valuing and being inspired by in, for example, visual neuroscience and computational neuroscience. And I can't say she's completely solved that problem because it may take a while, but it's a really great challenge. It's one that inspires me, the way she works on it. And I hope that it's one that we can all learn from and be inspired by, and to see where she is and where she's going with this. So, Judy, please tell us.
Okay, wow. Okay, I wasn't totally prepared for that. That was incredibly kind, Josh. It's really, thank you, and thank you all for being here. I can't actually express how wonderful today has been so far. I have a lot of affection and respect for this department and community and the kind of values, scientific and otherwise, embodied in the work that you all do here. And so it really is a treat to spend a few minutes telling you about some of the work that we've been doing. So we study cognitive tools. What are those? Okay, let's start with something as familiar and simple as the number line. I've been told not to move around as much because we're using this mic. Okay, I'm gonna try to do that. Nature didn't give us the number line. We invented it, okay? So as the Spanish architect Antoni Gaudí once put it, there are no straight lines or sharp corners in nature, but that didn't stop us. Okay, we created them anyway, and we extended the number line, of course, a few hundred years ago to create rectangular coordinates, which turned out to be super useful. They were genuinely cutting-edge tools for thought, for driving new mathematical discoveries, when René Descartes and his contemporaries realized that you could link up algebraic expressions with geometric curves in order to solve all kinds of mathematical puzzles, including this one that has stumped the world for millennia. How many are familiar with this particular, the Delian problem, this like riddle of the Oracle of Delos? It's the problem of how do you double the volume of a perfect cube. It's really, really difficult to do using the mathematical methods of that community and time. And here's the solution for that. And it'd be really hard to overstate the impact of this invention over the last 4 centuries. That technology converted all kinds of problems like these, where you might want to find the set of values that satisfies 2 equations, into essentially problems that relied on locating points of intersection between 2 curves. Now, imagine what happened next to that revolutionary tool. it became something that we could take for granted. It became so useful that it's become basically indispensable to the way every generation is educated. Virtually every mathematics curriculum on the planet introduces a combination of symbolic and graphical notation for representing and manipulating mathematical objects. And the question that we wrestle with is, how did we get here? And what is it about the human mind that makes that kind of continual innovation possible? There are lots of ways of approaching that question from many different disciplinary perspectives, including history, anthropology, economics. And I think that cognitive science also has a really important contribution to make here. And I think the story begins at least 30 to 80,000 years ago, when anatomically modern humans began to mark up their physical environments, essentially, including these cave walls here, iconically, repurposing objects and surfaces in their surroundings into carriers of meaning. We obviously didn't stop at cave walls. The story of human learning and discovery is deeply intertwined with.
Okay. The problem that academia has to reach the general public or regular people, it's precisely that there's a stage in which uh, your knowledge becomes so advanced and you're surrounded by by people who are just as advanced, that the language that you use is way more complex. Now, I um I can understand in some of you, especially if you're a kid, watch this and don't understand anything. Uh, Maybe I can put it like in simpler words, some of the things. Uh, right now, what like she's talking about how humans have um, developed tools throughout history to understand the complexity of things and to study them and to convey them or to communicate them to other people. Um, so the first technologies that she's talking about are like, yeah, it's historically thinking, um, like surfaces, like using surfaces are as conveyors of meaning. It means that you are using um, like walls, rocks, anything that is flat. Well, not necessarily flat, but something that you can um, write on to write. So walls, rock slabs, leaves. You know. So that's how we, because that's the thing, is like we take for granted the fact that we write or that we have computers, and computers are an emulation of paper, and computers basically are an emulation of a rock and a wall, if you think about it. It's just it's made differently, but how we convey information is very interesting, to think that it could have been some other way. Like one of the ways is precisely talking and listening to people. uh, but the fact that you can storage information and transport it so that you can, and sorry, I have to close another browser because it's messing up with the stream. Anyway, so technologies or objects that will help you transport, communicate, share that information. So here she's saying we started with surfaces now, and we didn't stop there. Let's see what she
The
says.
story of technologies for making the invisible visible.
Okay, so that this is the point of the lecture or part of it, that it's when you have an idea, it is invisible, but when you show it to somebody else, because that's the thing, like I can tell you about an idea just by talking, and you might understand it. But if I convey the idea into graphic depictions, like images, video, whatever, it's easier for you, photographs, illustration, um, it's easier for you to understand because you have a symbolic representation of the concept that I'm trying to share with you. So so yeah, metaphorically speaking, what you are doing is turning the invisible, which is an idea, an abstract machination, into something visible. And that capacity of sharing through through vision reinforces. It's easier to digest because it emulates the way we experience firsthand reality. I mean, people who can't see. um, that's why also videos, streaming, and everything is so effective, because it's a representation of life itself, uh, in moving images, pretty much.
So here are just a few examples from the history of science, which I love. We've got Darwin's finches, and these illustrations produced by John Gould, the ornithologist that Darwin worked very closely with. Only when you see these cases side by side does the kind of morphological variation begin to really become salient and pop out. We have the telescope that Galileo used to observe the movement of the moons around Jupiter, the kind of resolution that he needed in order to question the orthodoxy when it came to how the solar system was organized. We have Ramon y Cajal's much celebrated drawings of the retina as seen under the microscope, showing us what different parts of that part of the nervous system.
This is quite interesting because it's precisely, it would be way more difficult for me to describe you how a retina works or looks if I only have words. If I can show you a diagram or a representation like this one, it's easier for you to imagine inside. So it helps us elicit images and concepts that are abstract. Also, like the stars or the evolution of the bird. Um, Mostly the stars is like, how can I tell you that the stars move and then come to the conclusion that, oh no, they don't move, it's us who's moving. Oh, it turns out that everything is moving. So if I tell you it went from here to here, it's like, okay, but once you see a diagram of how it behaves in different stages, it allows us also to find a pattern that otherwise it would be very difficult to notice unless you were actually seeing. And because that's the thing, like, somebody who's interested in something takes ages. Just like it takes days or hours to look at the stars and see what that they're moving. But if I give you a graph like this one, like, or a chart with the specific movements, I can convey the information that it took me one one day to acquire. You can assimilate it like easily with just looking at the diagram. So it also makes information uh, it allows it to travel faster, pretty much.
Were like and how they were hooked up to one another. And in the 20th century, we have Feynman diagrams, named after, of course, the physicist Richard Feynman, showing us subatomic particles winking in and out of existence, events that we literally could not and will never be able to observe directly with the naked eye. And more than any other species, we leverage this understanding, this expanding understanding of the world, in order to, well, maybe to go back just one beat, is that, like, I want to draw your attention to the variation on this slide. So notice that some of these images are quite detailed and faithful, if you will, to the way the visual world looks to us when we open our eyes. Let's take Darwin's finches at the top left, for example. Others are much more schematic. But what all of these examples share in common is they leverage what I've been calling visual abstraction to communicate what we see and know about the world in a format that highlights what is relevant to notice, okay? And then building on that, we leverage that expanding understanding of the natural world through the use of those tools for learning in order to create new things. So, for example, our detailed understanding of physical mechanics allowed us to design and then build high-precision timekeeping devices. And a lot of this technological progress has been driven by our ability to continually reformulate our understanding of the world in terms of those useful abstractions that make it possible to re-engineer the physical world according to our design. So, translating biological insights into bioengineering, physical theory into advanced physical instrumentation, neuroscience into medical devices, and quantum mechanics into modern electronics. Okay, so this is, a sampling the kind of phenomena that I take a lot of inspiration from, and the question we continue to wrestle with is like, what about us makes all of that possible? This is a schematic that I've been using over the last few years to help me think about the key behavioral phenomena in play, and that'll also serve as a framework for embedding the different lines of work that I'll be sharing with you. So this is one way of illustrating the traditional mode in cognitive psychology, my home discipline, which focuses on how people process information supplied by the external world. Here's how that picture is enriched by the study of social cognition, which considers the behavior of multiple individuals at once and how they interact with each other. When those activities are used in the service of learning about the world and sharing that knowledge with others, they've been argued to share important similarities with formal science, even when pursued by non-experts in everyday contexts. So, building on that tradition and with the goal of understanding how humans made all those remarkable discoveries and inventions that I shared with you just a minute ago, I'd like to argue that there's still two critical ingredients missing from this picture. First is an account of cognitive tools or technologies, material objects that encode information intended to have an impact on our minds, how and what we think. Second, I like to argue that the time has come to embrace science's natural complement, engineering, how people leverage their understanding of the world, whether it's through direct experience or is socially mediated, to create new and useful things. Because without a serious consideration, the engineering half of this picture, I would venture to say that we'll never be able to explain how and why the world as we know it came to be. So at its core, if I had to state it really bluntly, research in my group aims to close this loop, okay, to develop psychological theories that explain how we go about discovering useful abstractions that explain how the world works, jointly with theories that explain how we then apply those abstractions to go make new things. And my plan today is to tell you about some of the work that we've done so far along two lines. In the first part, I'm going to share with you what I think we've figured out about how people leverage visual abstraction to communicate semantic knowledge, using freehand drawing as a central case study there. Ordinarily, in the second part, I would then have told you about our work investigating how people learn and coordinate on procedural abstractions when building physical things, aligned with the engineering segment. But today, I wanted to try something new with you all. So I wanted to instead share with you some of our emerging work. So I'm really curious to hear what you think. Exploring the cognitive foundations of data visualization. Okay, in which people harness multiple information modalities, graphical elements, words, and numbers to engage in statistical reasoning. In other words, to learn from finite amounts of evidence about aspects of the world that might be difficult or impossible to learn through direct observation by a single individual. Okay, and I'm still happy to chat with folks about our work on physical assembly and physical reasoning, probably at the reception, okay? So to dive into part one, how do we begin to think about how people use visual abstraction to communicate what they know and what they see? Here, I think it's useful to think about three behaviors that build successively on one another. So first, of course, visual perception, the problem of how we transform raw sensory inputs into semantically meaningful perceptual experiences. That in turn makes it possible to even contemplate visual production, okay, that ability to generate a set of markings that leave a meaningful and visible trace in the physical environment. And those come together during visual communication. How we decide just how to arrange those graphical elements and in what order in order to have a particular kind of impact on other minds, whether it is to inform or teach, persuade, collaborate, or any other purpose that we can put those marks to. Okay, so This is going to be an overview of the 3 studies that I'll be walking through. First, we'll begin with the question of what is the perceptual basis for understanding what a certain class, a subclass of pictures, represents. So to get off the ground, we started by considering maybe the most concrete and familiar instantiation of visual abstraction, creating a drawing by hand that looks like something in the world. What makes it so easy to tell that the drawing on the left of this slide is meant to correspond to the realistic bird rendering on the right? There have been a lot of different ways of responding to that question. The 2 have been really dominant. So the first view is that we essentially see drawings as meaningful in representing things because drawings simply resemble objects in the world. Okay? Like this drawing literally looks like the bird, and that's how we know. The second response is that drawings denote objects primarily as a matter of convention. And we only learn which drawings go with which objects and meanings from other people. So if you take this Chinese character, for example. So in an earlier line of work, my collaborators, close collaborators, Dan Yeamans, and my PhD advisor, Nick Trick-Brown, and I discovered that general purpose vision algorithms, so in this case, neural networks that compose multiple layers of learnable spatial convolutions that were trained on natural photographs, were capable of generalizing fairly strongly to even quite sparse sketches that didn't look photorealistic per se, suggesting that the problem of pictorial meaning and resemblance might be resolved simply by building better models of the ventral stream of visual processing, especially ones that accurately capture those operations performed in those brain regions. We were not the only ones to discover this. There are easily thousands of computer vision papers indexed by Google Scholar that use some kind of ConvNet or other neural network-based backbone to encode sketches and natural images for a variety of applications. All of those results you can kind of think of as vindicating an updated, modern resemblance-based account. It was also a really useful insight for us locally with other practical consequences. So in some more recent work led by Charles Liu, a former master's student in the lab, and in collaboration with Xiaolong Wang at UCSD, we built on top of those early findings to further stress test that resemblance account, basically taking a ConvNet backbone and then training a decoder on top that could map local elements in a sketch to corresponding elements in a photograph under the constraint that you could warp or rumple the sketch but not tear any holes in it, okay? And the success of that approach, I'm just demoing here, it's not really a result, it's like more of a demo. The success of that approach suggests that fairly strong spatial constraints govern how the parts of sketches correspond to the parts of real objects that they're meant to represent. Okay, so that's great, okay? We've got good enough trainable models of sketch understanding to build downstream applications that work pretty well, okay? I guess we can pack up and go home. But of course, that's not the whole story, okay? A static, deterministic account of visual processing falls short of explaining how we generate and make sense of drawings like these, which you might find all around this building. What these blobs and boxes, squiggles, and arrows mean depends on what we're talking about. So our next goal was to figure out how to incorporate that information about context to begin to account for a greater variety of graphical representations that we in fact use to communicate, ranging from more faithful pictures like those on the left here to the more obvious symbolic tokens on the right. Our first paper tackling that issue asked how people knew when they needed to produce a more faithful drawing and when they could get away with something more schematic or abstract. So in that study, we paired 2 people up to play a drawing game. The sketcher saw a display that looked something like this, where their goal was to draw the highlighted target object, okay, the third one here, and we varied what the other objects in the display were. On close trials, the distractors all belonged to the same basic level category, whereas on far trials, the distractors were from different categories, okay? Using this really simple manipulation, we discovered how readily ordinary folks, okay, can adjust the way they use depiction to communicate, making more detailed and faithful drawings on those close trials when they needed their drawing to uniquely identify a particular exemplar, but then sparser drawings on the far trials when they could get away with these like category level abstractions. So here are some examples of actual drawings that we collected in that study. And we found that sketchers used fewer strokes on far trials, less ink, less time to produce those drawings, while still achieving ceiling accuracy on the fundamental task of communicating the identity of the target visual concept to the viewer, who themselves took less time on those trials to make their decisions. Then to capture that behavioral pattern, we proposed a computational model of the sketcher that consisted of two parts, okay? So a convenet to encode visual inputs into a generically abstract feature space, and then a second probabilistic decision-making module that inferred what kind of drawing to make depending on the context. I'm just going to give you the take-home from that study because I'm really excited to get to other work in this talk. So the take-home from our model ablation experiments was that both the capacity for visual abstraction, which you operationalize as the network layer in the visual encoder module, and sensitivity to context were critical for capturing how people manage to communicate about these objects at the appropriate level of abstraction. Okay, and then in more recent work, we pushed that idea even further to understand not only the impact of the current referential context on how people communicate, but also the conditions under which new graphical conventions might emerge. When memory for previous interactions with the same person leads people to produce even more abstract, maybe even proto-symbolic tokens over time whose meaning depends even more strongly on that shared history. Okay, so all of that was really exciting progress to me, but of course, people possess much richer knowledge about the world than just what things are called or what they look like. And a particularly important way that we use visual abstraction, especially in science, is to transmit mechanistic knowledge about how things work. So what is going on in people's minds when they make that move? Going beyond what is visually salient, let's say about a specific bird, to highlight underlying physical mechanisms. For example, how birds achieve flight in general. So you can imagine my excitement when Holly Huey, a wonderful former PhD student in the lab who's now at Adobe Research, was also fascinated by this question. And while we knew from very cool work by Frank Kyle and colleagues that people privilege mechanistic explanations when learning from others, and from work by Robert Tversky, Mickey Chi, Tanya Lombroso, and others that people can learn by producing explanations, we realized there was a lot that we didn't know about how people thought about visual explanations. Like, what do people think is supposed to go into a diagram that illustrates how something works, and what makes those different from an ordinary illustration that is just intended to look like something? One possibility that I'll sketch, which I'll call the cumulative hypothesis, is that people basically think of visual explanations as being like extended, augmented versions of ordinary depictions. So in this table, explanation.
Okay, so so one thing is to recognize an object and to communicate it, like say that's a bird, this is how a bird looked like, and I make a drawing and this is a bird. Even though you've never seen a bird, you will understand once after seeing my drawing. You when you finally see a bird, you're gonna understand. It's like people who've never watched the sea, for example, and it doesn't have to be a drawing. Once again, it could be a video. You watch the video, and the video of the sea, and you go like, oh, okay, so this is how the sea looks like, and and eventually you will go to the beach and like, oh yeah, this is how it looks like. Now, entirely different topic is how the sea moves. So the way it moves, the waves, the tide moving. So that's a different story. But in the example, I'll go back to the sea example. but it's easier to explain with the bird. The bird is the bird flies. When you see the first depiction of the bird, you don't think, oh, it actually flies. But how it works, like what are those things to the side? Oh, those are wings. Oh, and what are those for? Oh, it's because they help the bird fly. What is flying? So yes, um it's practically impossible to understand with the image, but these explanations that she talks about, that is like an accumulation of significance, is like, okay, so I understand that there are bird flies because I watch them in real life, and I see that when they lift the wings, it means they're flying. So here you have two depictions of the bird. That is one static, just like uh, standing there, and another one flying. Immediately, when you see the shape of the bird flying, you think, "Oh, it's flying." You will never think that this second image here, this second image here, means that it's standing like here, and vice versa. So we generate a new depiction to explain what the thing does, in this case, the bird. Now, when you get enough examples of birds flying and things, I mean, which are pretty much animals with wings, when you see a mosquito and you see that the anatomy is related to a bird, it's similar to a bird, you would assume or infer that it flies as well. Same thing with a plane. You see a plane, oh, this thing flies. Like if you see a plane on the ground, you could assume it flies because of its resemblance to a bird. Once you get the information, of course, that birds fly and this is how the wings work and whatever, right? Very different story if you watch a helicopter, because it doesn't have wings. Like you will never think it flies unless you have another previous reference that explains you, oh, it flies. So uh cumulative, it just means that you are stacking one uh, meaning into another and finally generate an hypothesis of, oh, so the thing must fly because this and this and that, comparing to the information that I have of previous models, that in this case would be many birds plus planes plus whatever.
Explanations would have all the things that depictions have to communicate visual appearance, and then tack on information about physical mechanism. Okay. An alternative possibility, which I'll call the dissociable hypothesis, is that people think of explanations as being images that pick out mechanistic abstractions while greatly de-emphasizing visual appearance. Okay, there's a kind of selectivity there. So to tease apart those possibilities, Hawley designed a study to probe this question in two ways. First, by characterizing the content of visual explanations in detail and comparing them to visual depictions. And second, to measure how well either of those kinds of images actually help downstream viewers perform the task, extract information that they really needed, whether it's about appearance or about mechanism. So rather than a lesson on bird flight, which is fascinating but complicated, Hawley constructed 6 novel contraptions with a clearly observable mechanism for closing a circuit and turning on a light. Okay, so here's an example of one of those machines. And
yeah, this is very interesting because you see this thing and you already know what it does. Like if you already have the interest in circuits, so this somehow it's gonna turn on the light, maybe with the gears turning around. Like it's gonna be an overcomplicated process. Like what I assume is it's gonna be an overcomplicated process to turn on the light. But you know that there are gears involved, there's this wire, there's a light, it's gonna turn on.
And the instructional video that participants watched.
There you go.
Okay. All right, participants in the study actually saw that twice, those two demonstrations twice, but there you go. So notice that this machine consists of three different kinds of parts, okay? There are causal parts that need to rotate to turn the light on.
Yeah, so its causal parts is what caused the thing. So are we will say the actual useful parts. The other ones seem similar to the causal, but they don't have a wire, therefore are just more like an decoration. And the background is just there, or it's structured to hold the other ones. Um, you can even add the background of the picture as another part. I mean, it's not part of the system, but like visually speaking, it's like why that thing is gray, why the background isn't green, for example. It doesn't matter. Like, where by understanding and identifying the causal parts, we could understand what is actually going on and what are the important parts, and we would infer that we don't need any of the machinery. We just need the wires and just put them together.
There are non-causal parts that look very similar but don't actually cause the light to turn on. And then background structural elements that are colorful and hoist up the other parts are really important but don't directly participate in the light activation circuit. Every participant produced explanations of some machines and depictions of other ones. On explanation trials, they were asked to imagine that their drawing would be used by someone else to understand how the object worked. And then on the depiction trials, they were asked to imagine that their drawing would be used by someone else to identify which object it was out of a lineup of similar looking objects. Okay, that's the manipulation, really simple. Using that procedure, we collected a large number of depictions and explanations of each of these 6 machines. Eyeballing them, the drawings seem to look different, okay? For example, maybe there's a little bit more background in the depictions. Maybe there's some more arrows in the explanations. But Holly wanted to be really systematic about this, so she crowdsourced tags assigning every single stroke in every drawing to one of 4 categories, okay? So one for each of the 3 kinds of physical parts, background, causal, and non-causal. And then a 4th category that was a catch-all for symbols, okay? So in this particular context, we're talking about arrows and motion lines. And then use those tags to compare what balance of semantic information people emphasize in these 2 conditions. What she found was that while people drew causal and non-causal parts in both conditions, they allocated more strokes to the causal part and explanations than the non-causal ones, okay? They also emphasize the background a bit more in depictions than explanations, and as we suspected, spent more of their ink on symbolic displays of motion and parts interacting in explanations than depictions. Okay, so already these results are incompatible with a strong version of the cumulative hypothesis, which would have predicted the relative emphasis on background causal and non-causal parts would be maintained even in the presence of arrows. But however reliable, those differences might just amount to stylistic variation that doesn't have any impact on how useful they are for the tasks that they were intended to support. So to measure those functional consequences of those decisions, Holly designed 3 different inference tasks. The first asked how easily you could tell what kind of action would be needed to operate the machine. So here, pull, rotate, or push. What you might expect a good mechanistic explanation to make clear. The second was to measure how well each drawing could be used for object identification, exactly what depictions are supposed to do.
This is what people do in manuals, and it's hard to representate to represent to make a representation of to represent movement and specific tasks, especially when it's a complicated thing, like for example furniture that it's very difficult to assemble. You have to be very specific and create a lot of diagrams because it's not going to be solved in just a single movement.
And then the third was a more challenging visual discrimination task where you had to determine which of two highlighted parts was the causal one, okay? Requiring you to establish a detailed mapping between the parts of the drawing to parts of the actual machine, something that you really only expect from a mechanistic explanation that also preserved enough information about the overall appearance and organization of the parts of the machine. So, under the cumulative hypothesis, what we should see is that explanations are at least as good as depictions for all tasks, but under the dissociable hypothesis that they might be better for the action task, but worse for the object task. And what Holly found was more consistent with the dissociable account, where explanations better communicated how the mechanism worked, but depictions were better for communicating object identity. Interestingly, explanations were not better in this sample for conveying the identity of the causal part in that challenging third task, consistent with the idea that by leaving out a lot of the background details in some of those explanations, that they may have abstracted away the very information that would make it easier to link up specific parts of the drawing with parts of the machine. And the bottom line from those studies is that people share intuitions about what is supposed to go into a visual explanation, even if this is the first time they've been asked to generate one. And it can mean sacrificing visual fidelity to emphasize more abstract mechanistic information. And more generally, this work shows how important communicative context and goals are for understanding why people draw the way they do, why depictions look the way they do, and provided some experimental and analytic tools for characterizing the strategies people use to communicate visual information that is goal and context relevant. Okay, and then in this next section, we'll be asking, what would it take to develop artificial systems that are capable of human-like visual abstraction?
Yeah, so pretty much this is all destined to make AI better at understanding our way of mental processes, the way we process information in our brains, or cognitive processing.
And here's why. We fundamentally want
Because at the end, what we want, I mean, this is, I don't know if it's related to what she's going to say, but what they're trying to get at, or what we want as humanity as a whole, is that computers serve us. And if it's intelligent, artificial intelligence, it's going to serve us. The best way that we can achieve that goal is by make computers understand us, pretty much. So this is just one of the aspects in which they can understand us, which is understanding image representation.
Useful scientific models of visual communication. And the work I've presented so far is representative of where we've prioritized making investments, namely the development of experimental paradigms and data sets to measure and characterize those behaviors in fuller ways across a broader range of settings. Meanwhile, we've also been investing considerable energy in evaluating how well any member of the steadily advancing cohort of machine learning systems might continue to be relevant and promising candidates for capturing more detailed patterns of human behavior in these high-dimensional tasks, specifically as models of human image understanding, as well as models of image creation. Okay, so the task setting that we consider takes inspiration from this famous series of drawings by Pablo Picasso. Some of these are very detailed. The last few are very, very abstract, yet all unmistakably bulls. Any scientific model of human visual abstraction worth its salt ought to be able to represent the ways in which these bulls are all different from one another, and somehow at the same time, all bullish to their core, right? Or rather, as bullish as they actually look to real human observers. So in this work, that was a huge team effort led by Kushan Mukherjee, who is defending this Friday before joining the lab as a postdoc, with contributions again from Holly, as well as Charles Liu, Yael Vinker, who's here actually, and Ryo Agina Kang. We we began from the premise that like a strong test of whether we're on the right track towards those scientific models is that we'll be able to build algorithms that can generate and understand abstract images the way that people do. Sketch understanding, okay, is one of these deceptively simple yet poses a fundamental challenge for general purpose vision algorithms because, for one, it requires robustness to variation in sparsity, okay? Like some sketches are more detailed than others, you could say. And two, because sketches demand tolerance for semantic ambiguity, because sketches can reliably evoke multiple meanings. So we created a benchmark, which we call SEVA, to pose those challenges explicitly. Okay, so we collected 90,000 hand-drawn sketches made by about 5,500 people of 128 visual concepts under varying production budgets. So here's some examples of what it looks like when people had to create sketches cued by a photo. These are photos taken from the Things data set, if you're familiar with that, in less and less time. Okay, so by the time we get to the 4 seconds, they're real sketchy. We then took those drawings and then showed them to both people and 17 different then state-of-the-art vision algorithms representing a broad array of different kind of architectural commitments and strategies and training protocols. Yes?
Quick question of clarification. Do people get to think about it before you start the timer, or did they see it and then they have 4 seconds?
That's something that's been haunting me for 2 years. Not enough. I think they no. And I think, so what we're studying.
Does that time include both thinking and drawing?
Thinking and drawing. So they see the image and then they have to go. Okay, so we don't know exactly how, there is this restriction on the overall trial duration. I think that to really get at the bull phenomenon, I would want to give them unlimited planning time and then just limited execution time, and that would have been the way to do it. This is not that, okay? So there's like another data set that has yet to be born that isolates that more directly. Okay, yes. So the 4-second drawings are like quite derpy. Okay, that's like the technical term of art for that. But they are like what people did in those settings, okay? So we had all of these different sketches. They look the way they look under those conditions. Then both people and those vision algorithms perform the same sketch categorization task, allowing us to measure the full distribution of labels evoked by every individual sketch. Okay. The first thing we established was that as you give people more time to think about how to make and then go and make a detailed sketch, those sketches get more recognizable to models and people. They're less ambiguous as measured by the entropy of the label distribution. And even when the guess is wrong, okay, not the top one, okay, it's more likely to at least be in the right semantic neighborhood estimated by language embeddings. So that's reassuring. But then we dug in a little bit deeper and then found that while some models do, honest to goodness, perform better the recognition task than other models, the variation across models in terms of performance is totally dwarfed by the gap between models and people. The reliable signal in human recognition in terms of both performance, which I'm showing on the left, and also relative uncertainty about the meaning of a sketch, okay? So that suggests there's still a sizable human model gap in alignment to close here in terms of for sketch understanding. Nevertheless, okay, at the time we conducted this benchmark, we noticed that the CLIP-trained models were outperforming the others, making it a reasonable candidate to begin to explore generative models of sketch production built on top. So we explored the capabilities of a particularly cool sketch generation algorithm named Clipasso, whose development was led by Yael Vinger. We asked Clipasso to generate some sketches as well, and also manipulated its production budget. And in this case, the unit now, the currency, is the number of strokes, which is different, which I know, okay? And what we found is that even while human drawings and Clipasso's drawings were similarly recognizable, okay, across the 4 production budgets, by the way, this overlap in recognition and recognizability is like totally coincidental, given how the units are totally different. But we found that The really intriguing discovery here is that humans in Clipasso sparsify their drawings differently. So what I'm plotting on the y-axis on the right-hand side here is the divergence between the label distributions assigned by people to sketches produced by other people and sketches produced by Clipasso under those different budgets. So in other words, if you take seriously like a functional view of sketches as being for communicating concepts and characterize their meaning in terms of the full distribution of the labels and meanings that it evokes, then even though the 32-stroke Clipasso drawings and the 32-second human sketches look different when you look at them, okay, stylistically they are different, they are also quite functionally similar in terms of like the set of meanings that they convey in the distribution of meanings they evoke. On the other hand, as you tighten the production budget, that's where you really start to see much larger divergences between people and Clipasso. And we're hoping that this SEVA benchmark will be a useful resource for others who are interested in developing models of human-like visual abstraction. Okay. Now, in the second and I think shorter part, I'll give you a sneak preview of our newest and mostly unpublished work on multimodal abstractions and how they are used to support statistical reasoning. So back to that Cartesian coordinate plane. We're a room full of scientists. You don't need me to tell you when you're making observations about the world, it's never this clean. Instead of perfect lines, we might actually collect something like this, right? Collection of data points, they land where they land, and from which we try to infer some underlying structure with the actual generative process that gave rise to them. That inferential move is a fundamental building block of scientific reasoning, and we sure don't do it just by memorizing everything we've ever seen and thinking real hard. We use technologies, okay? Right? At the beginning of my talk, I showed you these examples of the use of drawings produced by hand as a particularly enduring and versatile, accessible tool for making the invisible visible. I think that's remarkable and worth understanding. But perhaps one of the most impactful technologies to have been developed in the modern era was the invention of data visualization. Like the telescope and microscope, plots help to resolve parts of the world that you can't see directly. But unlike either of those optical technologies, it allows you to see patterns and phenomena that might be too large, too noisy, too slow to see with our own eyes. They're ubiquitous in the news, the cornerstone of evidence-based decision-making in business and government, and they're indispensable in every field of science and engineering. What I'm showing you here is one of the first time series plots drawn ever by William Playfair in 1786, to show the balance of imports and exports from England over an 80-year period, from 1700 to 1780. For a while, imports exceeded exports, but then the relationship flipped in the 1750s as exports really took off. Here's the thing. Unlike a drawing of one of Darwin's finches, okay, if you haven't seen one of these kinds of images before, it may not be obvious what you're looking at. But once you learn how, it's a kind of superpower, right? Like
It's the same as language itself. Like when you don't know what an apple is, like the word apple. Like let's say that uh yeah, you don't know English and somebody comes and apple. What the hell is apple? So there's no way for you to read it. There's no way for you to understand it. But then it's given to you, and it's given with an association to the fruit, and then eventually you can infer what once you're given the system of how that's the way we learn a language. Like once you're given the system of how to translate information, now you can understand more. So once you know what an apple is, you can infer what an apple pie is, what apple juice is, and so forth. Now, so on. Uh, those are apples. Another example. What was I gonna say? I forgot. Um, you can infer meaning. Oh, yeah, languages themselves, codes. Like there's no way for you to understand Morse code the first time that you watch it, but once you're given the system to understand it, now you do. Same thing, for example, with music sheets. Uh, it's just it's they all are the most efficient way to convey information throughout history, and we keep those systems pretty much intact. So for example, in music, if you play the guitar, you can get tabs like guitar tabs on the internet. It's actually pretty common, especially for electronic guitar. Now those tabs serve for nothing if you play another instrument, mm, like the piano, for example, or the violin. But if you create the universal system of the how's that one called? The pentagram? No. This is let me see. Mm, 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 mm. No, the this is this a no? What's the name of that thing? Uh, what's the name? What's the name of the mm, graphic representation we use for music? Music score? No, 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 no. Mm, is it really graphic score? Come on, graphic graphic score. Really? So it's the score. I mean, just 'cause I forgot the name in Spanish as well. The staff. Yes, musical notation. Western musical notation. So the staff is the thing. All right. Yeah. Musical notation. The tablator. Tablator. Graphical notation. Yes, sheet music. Yeah, reading, sheet music, and tablet. So it's sheet music. Yeah, the staffs is. I mean, I don't know. I mean, musical notation. All right. Sheet music. Sheet music is a handwritten or printed form of musical notation that uses musical symbols to indicate the pitches, rhythms, or chords. Yeah, sheet music. Then it's sheet music, what I wanted to say. Because there are many forms of musical notation, that's why I was like, so it's sheet music? I thought that it was music sheet, but it's the other way around. Uh, all right. Well, this one works for a guitar player, a bass player, a piano player, violin, a violinist. It's just like they can all read from here. Doesn't matter what the instrument is. Anyway.
So many individual observations
Holy
can be
shit.
distilled
I
into
thought
a
that we
single graphic
Okay.
that tells a story that you can read just by
I'm
looking.
gonna.
And that's not even all the reasons I care about plots.
I
Because they're
tried
such a
to
powerful
write
tool for helping people update and calibrate their beliefs about a complicated world, developing the skills to read and interpret and even make graphs has long been a goal of STEM education in this country, something that's becoming even more important over time. The New York Times broke a story, it's actually from about a year ago now, about recovery from COVID-related learning loss in mathematics, based on work led by some of our education colleagues at Stanford and Harvard, and it looks like across a bunch of different states, the orange arrows are there, which means that there's been some recovery, but there's still a long way to go. And I think that successful theories that explain how people use these kinds of images to discover and communicate important quantitative insights will help us equip people with the kind of quantitative data literacy skills that they need more generally. So I'm going to highlight briefly 3 directions that we're pursuing in this vein. Our first question asks about the underlying operations that are needed to understand plots. So the strategy that we've been taking is to obtain machine learning systems that can handle questions about data visualizations at all, assess alignment with people, and then interrogate the source of any of those gaps. Any gaps there might be, okay? What we need, of course, to get off the ground is some way of measuring understanding. So here's what that might look like. Say we're looking together at this stacked bar plot, and someone asks you about the cost of peanuts in Las Vegas, okay? Take a moment to take it all in, scan around. Suppose that person then gave you 4 options to choose from, okay? I added the little charcoal thing. Now, if you thought it was A, you'd be right. But that's not what some prominent vision language models say, given this very same question. So in a Herculean benchmarking effort led by Arnav Verma, a current RA in the lab who's actually headed to the ECS program right here in the fall, we've conducted careful comparisons between humans and AI systems on 6 commonly used tests of graph-based reasoning, sourced from across the education, health, visualization, psychology, machine learning communities. All 6 of these tests were administered in as parallel a manner as possible to both human participants and several of these so-called multimodal AI systems, and that had been the ones that made it into this benchmark had been claimed displaying competence on other kinds of visually grounded reasoning tasks. We then recorded not only the overall score achieved by humans and these models, but the full set of error patterns they produced, which allowed us to assess, even when a model or a person got a question wrong, to see if they were getting things wrong in similar ways. What did we find? Here I'm going to show you for each of the 6 tests we included. They have funny names like GDR, VLAT, Calvi, Holf Multi. Actually, we made those. The bad name there is my fault. And also Chart QA, a subset from Chart QA. We recorded how well, we computed how well each of the models, so these are the ones that are showing up on Xtix in blue, orange, purple, and red, how well they did compared to how well humans did. That will show up in green. And these were US adults who had taken at least one high school math class. Okay. First, I want to give you a sense of how well these people did. That's our reference point here. This is how well all the models did. So we have, in this study, 2 variants of Blip2Flan 3 variants of Lava-based models, specialized systems, such as Matcha and its base model Pixdestruct, and finally, a closed proprietary model, GPT-4V. Across all these assessments, we did see a meaningful gap between models and humans, both under more lenient and a more strict rating protocol. This is a gap that we might have missed had we relied exclusively on the chart understanding benchmarks that are currently most popular in the machine learning literature. So this is the reason why we included chart QA, which is the rightmost facet on this slide. Okay, where the gap seems a lot smaller. Calvi, which is the third one, is really interesting because these are adversarially designed plots that have like funny y-axis like limits that require you to really attend closely. So like that's one we also see some larger gaps. We also analyze their full error patterns, so which can be really telling when no one is quite at ceiling. Again, there's only one way to get all the questions right, but there are lots of ways that you can be wrong and wrong reliably. So we found that even though GPT-4V might look to be approaching human-level performance, none of these models, GPT-4V included, generated human-like error patterns. So this is shown by all the dots here, falling well below the green shaded area, which represents the human ceiling. So the upshot is that while currently developing VLMs remain exciting and promising test beds for developing and parameterizing the hypothesis space of possible cognitive models of visualization understanding, there still are these systematic behavioral gaps that are worth interrogating further to realize those models' full potential. In parallel, we've also been developing experimental paradigms to probe a related facet of visualization understanding, the ability to design select the appropriate plot to address your epistemic goal, okay? So I'm going to talk to you about that next. The way we set up the problem is to imagine there's some question that you have about data set, right? Some, what I'm calling epistemic goal that a person's trying to satisfy, like, for example, like which group is better, okay? Let's say the left agent is trying to pick the plot to help shift the person's beliefs appropriately, okay? But if they had a different question in mind, maybe they might need a different plot, okay? That's the intuition. So this is the line of work that was launched by Holly Huey, and we formulated in a study hundreds of different questions that could, in principle, be answered by using real publicly available data sets, that ship with base R. So here's an example of a study one, tracking airplanes and bird strikes. Okay, what is the average speed of aircraft flying over overcast skies and counted bird strikes at 0 to 5K miles? We then presented participants with a menu. Sure.
5K miles.
Altitude. Yeah.
Here's not 5,000.
Sorry, five. Hold on. That might be a typo on my part. I don't think the question inherited that.
Anyways, don't worry about it.
I'm not. I'm starting to, but I'm going to resist that urge right now. No, I think that, yeah. So
But these, a lot of this is kind of full of all sorts of typos.
this is a templated thing. I think there are basically a lot of these questions are kind of funny. I think they could have been smoothed over a bit more. This is like a lot of these questions are kind of funny. I think they could have been no, it's good. So we had all these questions. Some of them were like better put than others. But we presented participants with a menu of possible graphs that they might show someone else in order to help them answer that question, however they interpret that question. Okay, whatever it is, those are the strings that we're showing to people. Okay, and they could choose from this menu either a bar plot, line plot, or scatter plot. Some of them were more distilled. Some of them were more disaggregated. Okay, and then we measured how often they picked each one in order to construct a choice distribution over plots. Okay, so here's what it looked like on average for the retrieve value questions in our stimulus set. There's like one they picked each one in order to construct a choice distribution over plots. This is the retrieve value subset of items. We then tested various hypothetical strategies that people might have used to pick the plots that they did. Clearly, they are showing some kind of bias here. The black curve. The purple curves here represent the predictions of like bar plot, line plot, or scatter plot purists. Okay, they just always went for the bar plot, but just like didn't care whether they had 3 variables plotted or more. We also considered the possibility that people might prefer more targeted visualizations overall, but not really care what type of graph they were sharing. Maybe they might prefer ones that show more of the data, maybe ones that hide, less of the variation in the data. The best candidate we found, that we considered, was the proposal that people are maybe actually sensitive to the features of those plots that were relevant for answering the question. And in fact, actually predicted the performance of about 1,700 other participants who tried answering every one of those questions, however weirdly put, when paired with every possible plot. Okay, so we went and actually measured performance and then constructed the distribution based on those performance levels, and then used that task in order to use the data from the task in order to generate predictions of the audience sensitive hypothesis. And this is where this is how the shape of those curves look when we're only considering retrieve value items. But if you look at the data set as a whole, we found that this audience sensitive proposal did well across the board. So what I'm showing here is essentially a model fit measure defined over the divergence between the predicted and the actual human choice distributions. Has a name, the Jensen-Shannon divergence, like an average of KL divergence for both ways. So I'm excited about that result as an initial validation of a strategy for measuring visualization understanding using more open-ended tasks, and also because it suggests that even non-experts, you could say, people who might not be professional scientists, are sensitive to those features of plots that make some suitable for answering some questions and others. And honestly, as someone who teaches interest stats for a living, gives me hope. In the final leg of our journey, we're going to take another critical look at this problem of measurement. Okay, so a few minutes ago, I showed you some results when using these 6 tests of data visualization understanding. These are the ones that we have today, which is why we use them in our benchmark study. Our question in this last study, in work that's actually now in press, and led by this extraordinary postdoc in our lab, Eric Rothbate, also with Arnav Verma, we're asking what are these tests actually measuring, and are they measuring the skills in the best possible way, and can we do better? Okay, so here's some initial steps towards answering those questions. To get some traction, we started with these 2, GGR and VLAT, these being some of the most widely used and established tests. We gave GGR and VLAT as a composite test to a large and diverse sample of U.S. adults. Actually, 2 samples, one that was recruited on the UCSD campus, and another that was recruited over prolific of the difficulty of individual items in both the college campus sample and the U.S. representative sample, which I think is reassuring. All things or similar things. Others, if so, those plots should be, it seemed to us that cross-tests an instant best max accounting that you might think of. All of the folks who've been involved in this work and other lines of work in the lab, it would not just...
Okay, so yeah, this was mostly interesting for researchers of AI and image creation, but um, what? Anyway, yeah, I'm gonna stop here, and I'm gonna make sure that I think that I'm gonna focus on education that goes towards uh, skills that can be generally used for people, because this was too specific. Like, I found it interesting, but there was a part which is like, dude, like, if I don't work in that, so something that would apply for everybody watching would be mostly psychological, social, uh getting to understand why people behave the way they do, why civilizations disappear, and so on. So I'm just gonna make sure that next time the content of the live streams is more useful for general population at least. Thanks for watching. Bye.